Hello and welcome to On Point. This episode features an interview with Brad Harrison, founder and managing partner of Scout Ventures, an early-stage venture capital firm making the world a better, safer place by investing in frontier and dual-use technologies built by veterans, intelligence leaders, and premier research labs. Brad is an entrepreneur and seasoned business development executive with a passion for building companies that are pushing the envelope of technological innovation. He has successfully helped incubate several companies out of the Scout office and has deep experience developing concepts to include co-authoring 3 patents in search, geo-tagging, and personalization. Brad was a distinguished honor graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1994 and served as an Airborne Ranger in the United States Army for 5 years before retiring as a captain. He also graduated from the MIT Sloan School of Management, where he studied new product and venture development. In this episode of On Point, Brad discusses his experience in the military as a leader and why he always put the lives of his soldiers first. He explains how the skills and experiences he had at West Point and in the Army helped prepare him to be an entrepreneur, venture capitalist, and mentor. Brad talks about his mission of making the world a better, safer place by guiding and investing in people to help build their business dreams and gain personal success. Now, please enjoy this interview between Brad Harrison and your hosts Tim Shaw and Lance Dietz.
Welcome to On Point, founded by Eddie Kang, West Point class of 2008. I'm Tim Shaw, West Point class of 2004.
And I'm Lance Dietz, class of 2008.
And today we're joined by Brad Harrison, class of 1994. Brad, how are you?
Feeling old around you guys, but I'm doing great. How's everybody doing today?
I'm doing great. Lance?
Great as well.
Awesome. We're really looking forward to this. Let's get into our first segment, AAR, or for our non-military listeners, After Action Review. In this segment, we'd like to touch on specifically what other veterans can learn from you, your process, and your journey. First and foremost, could you please tell us about your decision to attend West Point?
Yeah, I thought I was going to go play football at Princeton or do something like that. But actually, I grew up going to West Point as a kid. My mentor is a guy named Dick Parsons, who was chairman of AOL, Time Warner, and Citigroup. And when I was a kid, Dick used to take my best friend Greg and I up there. And so I always remembered the mystique of the cadets marching onto the plane and marching onto the field. And I was somewhere in high school and I had this epiphany that I didn't want to do what everybody else was doing. And so I got online, which back then was via dial-up, and I figured out how to do a weekend visit. And I went up and I spent the weekend, and that was it. I was hooked. And so I applied to early admissions and was one of the first 25 in the class of 94, accepted, and that was it. That was the beginning of the story.
And what was your West Point experience like?
Well, as grads, you know what they say. You know, you hate every day that you're at West Point, and then every day that you're gone, you miss and cherish those days. I actually loved West Point. I did well physically, militarily, and academically, especially coming from New York. I came from Westchester, so the schools were great. I had taken all AP classes. So my first year academically, I did very well. I physically did well. And then one of the most influential decisions in my career was, rather than try to make lightweight football or walk on the football team, when I went to tryouts, a firstie named Anthony DeToto said, "Hey, new cadet, come over here. Have you ever played rugby?" And I said, "No." And so I tried out for the rugby team, and I was one of 2 people from the class of 94 to make the core squad team. And so rugby was a really big part of my cadet experience. And so we got to travel, and we went to the UK and Australia. And so it was really an amazing experience. You know, I liked the jobs I had. I was a first sergeant. I was a battalion commander. So for me, I really enjoyed West Point.
And in terms of cadet, a lot of walking hours or not a lot of walking hours?
So I will tell you, I am the luckiest cadet in the world. I never walked an hour, not because I didn't get in trouble, but I always got in trouble right before some dignitary showed up and granted amnesty. And then one time I got in trouble, and my company TAC, or actually the battalion TAC, thought it was a really bad look for his first sergeant to get in trouble for something stupid. So I think those hours disappeared. So I never walked an hour.
Any particular classes that were super impactful?
Yes, I was in a core advanced theoretical economics track under a guy named Colonel Tom Dalla. And econometrics and those classes, Dalla was such a genius that he would get up on the board and he would draw simultaneous equations in either hand at the same time. And we would have to split up who took notes on what board and then meet after class to put them all together. Although I will tell you, my classmate Ted Williams was the best note taker in that class, but really just an amazing, really smart group of cadets at the time that have all gone on to do great things. Todd Morgenfeld, Aaron Hood, Ted Williams. I think Dave Ardafio was in that group. Yeah, so was very fortunate to be part of that advanced econ track.
Interesting. So your class seems almost as good as my class of 2004 and Lance's class of 2008. That sounds about right.
If either of you guys were infantrymen, I was the last 4-phase Ranger school. 4 guys died in my class. The old Corps. It was a little bit tougher back then, but now I'm sure it was the same.
I'm curious, Brett, what did you do during your summers?
Went to Buckner like everybody and actually won the superintendent's award. So finished first at Buckner, which is a trophy that's still in my parents' basement. I was pretty proud of that achievement. My next year, I wound up going to Panama for half the summer and working at the World Bank for the former economic advisor to the former Soviet republics, who was a class of 61 grad. So I actually gave up my summer leave so that I could go to Panama and do the World Bank, which was an awesome experience.
And then you talked about branching infantry. Could you talk about your experience in the Army?
For as long as I can remember, I grew up and my grandfather lived with us and he had been in the Navy around World War II. And so we grew up watching John Wayne and The Bridge Over the River Kwai and all of these old classic movies. And over the years, I always kind of wanted to be SF or Delta. So the path to be SF or Delta was go infantry. And, I guess I'm also the product of John Rambo and watching the Rambo series. I don't think there was any question. I only wanted to go light infantry. I was 5th in my branch. I contemplated going to Vincenza, but my year, they couldn't guarantee the slots to Vincenza, which meant if you didn't get Vincenza, you would have gone Mech Germany. And there was no way I wanted to take that chance. So I wound up going to the 25th and was a light infantry officer there and had really an amazing experience. I mentioned I was in Ranger class 395, where 4 students died. 2 of them, Kurt Sansucci and Spencer Dodge, were my classmates who were both in my Beast company. So I knew those guys really well. And then Sergeant Tillman and Captain Palmer were the other 2 fatalities. So, I'm sure you guys remember during military winter session, there's this assignment where they say, hey, cadet, you did something stupid as a lieutenant and 2 soldiers died. Write a letter to their families. And I remember that right before we graduated, that whatever it was, January or February intersession, and I couldn't get past, I regret to inform you. And I really thought to myself, like, I never want to be in a position where I do something and I have to write a letter to somebody's parents that they've died. For me, having those fatalities in Ranger school and then showing up as my first unit as a brand new platoon leader, and everybody in the Army knew what had just happened. So it was this really eye-opening experience. Like, hey, we're going in a profession where if you do something wrong, people are going to die. And so I carried that with me through my military career and really kept it close to my heart, Spence and Kurt. So I made a lot of decisions as a army officer where I always put the life of my soldiers first. And I remember we were getting ready to deploy to Haiti. And I don't know if you guys remember when Haiti went off in, I don't know, 96 or whatever it was. And I remember sitting in the gymnasium and we had the rules of engagement where they were hanging and we had to brief our soldiers. And one of my soldiers was like, "Sir, I don't understand. If they come out and they have a gun, but what do I do?" And I remember saying to the soldier, "If you don't know what to do, engage the enemy. Because I would much rather bring all of you home alive than have to bring you home in a body bag because you didn't understand the difference between what to do on the yellow card and the red card." And, I remember my platoon sergeant slapping me. He's like, "Sir, you can't say that." And I was like, "Hey, man, like, it's our job to bring these guys home. And if these guys don't understand the rules of engagement, we got to get them to understand them. But more importantly, we got to make sure they all come home." And so that stuck with me during my military career.
So you went to the 25th Hawaii, Haiti. Any other
I
points?
actually didn't. I actually wound up not getting sent to Haiti. They sent the other battalion, and we sat in a gymnasium and a tarmac for, I don't know, 24 hours, and then we came off alert. So I got to do a couple of pretty cool things. Went to Thailand to do joint training exercise there. Went to Australia, did a joint training exercise in the Outback. Went to Japan, ran a joint training exercise. And then I ran a real world mission on Wake Island where I ran a detention center for 109 Chinese immigrants that had been intercepted in international waters off the coast of Florida. 9 of them were members of the Chinese triad. And so it was our job to set up a detention center and process them. So we were on Wake Island for 49 days. And I had a detachment of 569 soldiers. So I had MPs, I had dentists, doctors, special forces. It was pretty good.
You mentioned a few individuals and rather larger than life individuals, Dick Parson, DeToto. I've heard a lot about him. And I'm curious, did you have any mentors or friends in the Army that really helped you?
My CEO, Brian Pearl, who was my second company commander, kind of always looked out for me. And so actually, I thought I was going to go to a Ranger bat. So I was interviewing with XOs for 2 of the Ranger bats and was down to the final selection. And then I got sent to Wake Island and we were on ComSec. So I came back from Wake Island and I called the XOs and I was like, "Hey, sir, I'm ready to go." And they're like, "Lieutenant, those slots are gone." And I was like devastated, totally heartbroken. So I decided that I was going to get out of the Army because I didn't want to go spend 8 years of staff time. Rather than get out early, I wanted to finish my full commitment. And Brian Pearl, who had also been a great CEO of mine, was actually the general's aide, the commanding general's aide. And he said, "Why don't you come up to division? I think I got the perfect job for you." And he said, "Do you know what the G5 does?" And I was like, "Sir, I have no idea what the G5 does." And he says, "Well, the G5 is in charge of military civil affairs. And there's this amazing guy named Major Ed Oliveris, who is the G5, and he needs a deputy." So I went to my interview with Major Oliveris, and he pulled up in like a 65 cherry red Mustang convertible. And he got out and he had long wavy hair. And back then, only SF guys wore berets. So he put on his beret. And I was like, I don't even need to hear the guy talk. I'm working for that guy. And then actually 3 months into my role, he got called back to brag, and I wound up becoming a primary staff officer as an O2 promotable, which was an amazing experience. And I feel very blessed that I had the Army career that I did. I think when I got out, you do feel like you kind of missed Iraq and Afghanistan. And so you feel like there's a gap in your service. Now, I didn't control that, but I have a lot of friends that spent 5, 6, 7 years overseas and made that sacrifice, not only putting their life on the line, but with their families. And so, part of me feels like I should have been there. And then I have a couple of classmates and rugby players that didn't make it home from there. And I feel super blessed that I didn't have to deal with a lot of those PTSD and other downsides of being deployed. So I had a very blessed West Point and military career, and I'm very thankful every day for it.
Brad, this seems like a great time to transition to our next segment, which is the SitRep for the situation report, where we dive into what you're doing now and how you're transforming industry. Would love to hear about your time since the military to where you're at now with Scout Ventures, and maybe we can dive into Scout specifically after that.
When I was getting out, I thought I was going to go be a technology investment banker. And then I quickly learned that the real world does not care about any of your experience in the Army. So they wanted to make me the same as a first year kid out of undergrad. And that just wasn't going to work for me. So I decided, actually, with the help of Tom Dalla, one of my mentors at school, Tom said, I know a guy at MIT Sloan, you should talk to him. And by the way, this is like the first week in August. Grad school starts in 3 weeks. So I called this guy on a Friday, and his name is Rod Garcia. And Rod, it turns out, is the head of admissions at MIT Sloan. And so I tell Rod my Army story and kind of that I want to start companies and I want to be in venture. And Rod goes, this is super interesting, but just so you know, we're not accepting applications anymore. But here's what you can do. Download the application off of the web, spend all weekend, do all the essays, fill out all the application, and fax me your application Monday morning. So I went to my parents' house in Westchester. I was living with two classmates, Ted Williams and Rich Swift, on the east side. They were both in investment banking and finance. I went to my parents' house. I locked myself in my childhood room. I wrote essays all weekend. And 9 o'clock Monday morning, we faxed the application to MIT. And like a good Army officer, I called at 9:45 to confirm receipt. And they said, yep, we got your receipt. We really have no idea what we're going to do. There's no slots. We'll let you know. I went back to my computer, and about 15 minutes later, in my AOL account, there was like a link to put a deposit down for MIT Sloan. And I was like, what's going on? I called MIT back, and I could hear they were having an admissions thing. And they were like, everybody heard your story and they want to give you a chance. So welcome to MIT. A week later, I was in Boston and I was at MIT. I was very fortunate. I got to study exactly what I do today, which is new product and venture development. I was there 99 to 01, so right in the middle of the first dot-com explosion. And so because of that, a lot of second year grad students were dropping out to pursue dot-coms. So I had an opportunity as a first year to be teaching assistant for a class called New Enterprises, which at MIT used to be 15390. I think it's still 15390. And it was taught by a guy named Howard Anderson, who is the founder of the Yankee Group, and a guy named Todd Dagris, who was a partner at Battery Ventures, which Howard had helped start. And Todd actually did the Akamai deal while I was his TA, which is one of the fastest, most successful venture investments ever. So I got to basically be at ground zero of some amazing stuff. And then I mentioned earlier in the podcast that Dick Parsons' son, Greg Parsons, was my best friend. Greg actually wound up going to Princeton. I wound up going to West Point. And I went to visit him freshman year, and his roommate was a guy named Steve Papa. And in 99, Greg called me and he said, hey, you should call Steve Papa. He's at Harvard Business School and he's starting a tech company. So I actually started interning for Papa while I was still at school. Papa started a company that he wound up selling to Oracle for $1.037 billion called Endeca Technologies, which was one of the first dynamic search engines that was focused on, attribute-based filtering and taxonomy. And I literally carried the computers from Steve's first apartment into the first office. And the two things I remember most about that experience is, number one, the original name of the company was not Endeca. It was called OptiGrab. So I was part of the original OptiGrab company. OptiGrab is the device that Steve Martin invents in the movie The Jerk. You guys are probably too young to remember that. But when we actually raised money from Feldy Harmon, they made us change the name of the company and we came up with Endeca. And the second thing is that my call sign in the Army, the longest of any of the call signs that I had, was War Pig 6. And Steve Papa told everybody that they were not allowed to call me anything but War Pig 6. So Steve is now worth a couple of $1 billion, has started all these amazing companies. And I guarantee you, if I called Steve Papa on that cell phone right now, he would go, War Pig 6, what's going on? So it was really an amazing way to be an entrepreneur, understand venture, sit in funding meetings, and really let guys like Steve Papa be part of my education in what a great entrepreneur is. I then graduated during a nuclear winter, tried to launch a fund called Patriot Venture Cap. Originally, it was called Gladiator Group. Then we were called Patriot Ventures with an 83 Naval Academy grad, and we couldn't raise money. And then I wound up deciding to go to AOL in DC so that I could get some corporate experience. So I was fortunate enough to be there when Steve Case and Bob Pittman and Ted Leonsis were still in charge. Got to write a couple of patents, got to work for Ted and be a fly on the wall in the boardroom. And it was a really amazing experience. Then I fell in love. My wife was in New York. I was in DC. So I transferred to New York. And then I went to a startup, grew that to about 100 million in revenue, thought we were going to go public, got hit with Web 1.0 privacy concerns. We wound up not going public. And then in 2005, I went out on my own and really just followed my passion, which was to help people start companies. I was kind of like a paid consultant. I worked at a handful of clients. One of them was a company called Pubmatic, an amazing entrepreneur named Amar Goyal, who took that company public 2 years ago, which was amazing because I had shares from 2005 that I spent the $5 to buy the options. And then here we were, I don't know, 12 years later, and the company went public, and they were worth a lot of money. It was great. So I became really a consigliere for early stage venture before the New York tech scene had really become what it is now. And then I went through the nuclear winter, which was the end of 07 and the financial crisis of 08 coming in 09. And then finally, I got really good advice from Dick Parsons and Todd Dagris and a handful of my mentors who said, you know what, Brad, you want to be an investor? Go be an investor. Stop playing consultant. Figure out where to get the money from, but just start investing. So I took that advice. And in December of 09, I convinced my dad to give me a little bit of money. And I convinced a class of 95 guy named Clay DiGiacinto to give me a little bit of money. Actually, Clay refused to give me the money. What Clay said that he would do is he would write two $50,000 checks. He would wire them directly into the companies. And then when I created a fund, he would roll them over into LP interests. And that's exactly what Clay did. And so with the support of family and friends, Fund One was born in 2011. We raised about $4.5 million to do a proof of concept. We had a couple of interesting companies where I had been the first or one of the first checks. And we convinced everybody to give us money for a follow-on fund. And then 18 months into it, we sold a company that I had written the first check, a company out of New York called Olapic. We sold for about 149 million, of which 130 million was upfront cash. And so we sent everybody back money, and all of a sudden we had like a business. And then what I realized, and a lot of this ties in with West Point, there was no way I was going to do what I was doing without getting organized, building processes, having institutional kind of diligence and all of that. And if you had come to my very first office, which was so long ago that WeWork didn't exist, it was at a Regis. And I remember I painted the wall with Idea Paint, which is that paint you can, use dry erase on. And the guy that was running the Regis had never heard of Idea Paint. And I was like, all right, don't worry, I'll take care of it. So I remember in my office, if you came to my office behind my desk, I had 24 notebooks that were due diligence notebooks on every single deal. Because just like being an XO in the Army, or just like being an S4, or just like being a G5, you have SOPs and you have procedures and everything is uniform. So I couldn't afford a lawyer. I had done all this contract work as a biz dev guy and at AOL. So I was doing my own reviews. I was doing my own due diligence, and I was printing it all out and putting it in a notebook. So if any investor wanted to see whether or not we were really doing due diligence, I just hand them the notebook. And, it's funny because in some of the entrepreneurial interviews we did, one of the first investments we did, which is now called League Apps, but at the time was called Sports Fight, Brian Litvik, the founder, talks about coming into my office and actually being scared of me because I was so organized. I actually wired him money before we even had an agreement. They needed to make payroll, and I was like, okay, we'll work out the paperwork. And so in my career, while I've been very by the book and built a lot of institutional things, I would say a lot of what I've done, which has earned the respect of the entrepreneurs, is that I really view myself as an entrepreneur. I don't come from money. I didn't find a big family office to stake me. I would make $2,500 to pay my rent, and I make $2,500 to cover my living expenses, or my wife was working. And then I would take every free dollar I'd have and I'd put it into entrepreneurs. And so when an entrepreneur was having an issue making payroll, and they would be like, Brad, we don't have time to do a financing event, I'd be like, okay, how much is payroll? And then I would make payroll for 3 months. And so I think having that entrepreneurial experience building my own firm and sharing that and doing things that may not be totally by the book. It's funny because at West Point, we're totally by the book. But when I was G5, I got to go to the Special Forces Warfare School for Civil Affairs and PsyOps. And if you hang out with SF guys long enough, or actually any special operators, you'll understand that there's by the book, and then there's all the other things that you have to do to get the mission done. And I have always viewed myself as I have a moral compass. I know the difference between right and wrong. Integrity is always at the top of the list. If they don't have their paperwork, but they need the money to make payroll, I'm going to wire them the money. And those were the things that I could do as an emerging VC that I think taught me a lot. Some of those deals didn't work out. Vic Singh, who is has this successful firm called the ENIAC, with 4 guys. So it's Vic, Hadley, Tim, and Nihal, who all went to UPenn together. Vic was an entrepreneur. Well, a lot of them were entrepreneurs, but Vic had a company, and he was in the middle of selling the company to AOL, and they couldn't get past this digital rights management issue. And Vic was like, the deal's not going to close. I can't make payroll. And I was like, no problem. I got you. So for the next 3 months, I wired him 50 grand every month to cover payroll. And then we sold the company to AOL. And not only did I enable that and make 2x on my short-term money, which was great, Vic and I have this amazing bond now, and we're on a board together. And, so I think that being a human combined with being an entrepreneur, combined with being a leader at West Point and in the Army, really gives you the ability to be so much more dynamic as an investor and think outside of the box. And for me, it's some of what I'm most proud of. And it's also some of what I think differentiates me in the world of, some people don't consider VCs in the highest regard, especially if you're, watching We Crash or Super Pump these days. So it really, I think, has been good for me.
I want to riff on two things. One is a comment and the second is a question. The first is love the ENIAC folks. The world is really small. Tim Young funded the first company that I personally invested in, Workflow. And then I found out he was my neighbor and now he's actually an advisor. So a quick plug on the ENIAC folks. Fantastic people.
Fantastic guys.
For sure. Second is you have founder empathy. And speaking of founders in AOL in your background, did you ever run into another AOL West Pointer, Jim Kinsey, the co-founder of AOL?
Yeah. So by the time I got there, I don't know, Kinsey was worth so many billions of dollars. I think maybe he came and spoke once, but I was like so low level. So I was never fortunate enough. Now, I did get to spend a lot of time with Ted Leonsis and another guy named Barry Appelman, who most people will say invented the buddy list. And actually, Barry, huge shout out to Barry Appelman. The first 5 years, our LP parties were hosted at Barry Appelman's amazing rooftop penthouse in Tribeca. So I always appreciated Barry being very supportive. And Barry was one of the smartest guys that I've ever met, just a total genius. But Ted was very aware of my relationship with Dick Parsons and always spent that extra 5 minutes giving me a little bit of advice or pulling me to the side or talking to me. And as a young executive in a company with a gazillion executives, those 5 minute sidebar conversations are really impactful. And so I try to remember that in the way that I interact with my entrepreneurs. If you write somebody $1 million check, all of a sudden that changes the dynamic. You're not the buddy anymore, right? Now you're the lead investor. But just because you're the lead investor doesn't mean you can't display founder empathy, humanity, and actually take the time to have a genuine connection. And ironically, what I'm going to say next is Tim was in town and I hosted a 50th birthday party and we had some comm challenges. So Tim wasn't here. But one of my entrepreneurs, who's a PhD named Hunter McDaniel, who started a company out of Los Alamos, Hunter found out that what I wanted for my 50th birthday was I wanted everybody to bring me a vinyl. I didn't want any booze. I didn't want any gifts. I wanted everybody to bring me a vinyl that meant something to them. And Hunter showed up at my house. I had never met him in person because of COVID, right? I had been on 15 board calls with him. I never met him, but he showed up and he was holding these 3 albums, super close to his heart. He was so excited to share. And that type of connection is the type of connection you want with your entrepreneurs, right? Where there's these things that are totally unrelated to the business, but allow you to realize that at the end of the day, you're just two people trying to build something. And I think it's really important, especially as VCs, that we don't lose sight of that. And I think a lot of my experience in the Army was related to that, which is just I remember hearing, listen, soldiers are going to respect your rank, but you want soldiers to respect the leader that's wearing the rank, the person that's wearing the rank. They're not going to go above and beyond because you're a lieutenant. They're going to go above and beyond because of how you treat them and mutual respect and the fact that you're the last one to leave the barracks when they're cleaning their weapons. And so I think you apply the same types of things to the way you deal with your entrepreneurs and the way you build companies. And I think that's something that I try to do as we build companies at Scout.
Brad, I think one thing, just an observation too, you played sports pretty competitively as well. And I think a lot of the stuff that you mentioned, team, network, having a plan, but having to step outside of that when needed, probably relates a lot to sports too. So I would imagine the background in sports plus the military aligns well with venture too.
Especially rugby. right? Because rugby is like organized chaos,
Yeah.
right? You have a plan, but like that guy gets tackled and he goes to the ground, and then like a huge bunch of people, and you got to reorganize. And I was a fly half. So you got to decide, are you going to go right, or you're going to go left, or you're going to kick it, or you're going to throw it, you're going to do loop one or loop two. So for me, it wasn't just sports. It was specifically rugby. And Anthony DeToto, you asked about my mentors. What most people don't know about DeToto and I is that because I was the plebe that sat on the core squad tables and DeToto was a firstie, I was essentially his errand boy. I had to run up to H lot to get the truck. I had to take the dirty uniforms. So I think being around DeToto and Garth Yarnell and Bill Marshall and Eric and all of these guys that were unbelievable athletes. I was a good athlete, but these guys were unbelievable athletes. I think being part of a team like that, and I think the 4 years I played rugby at West Point, we were in the top 10 in the country all 4 years. But your point, Lance, I think is really spot on, which is the same type of teamwork that comes out of organized team sports. It goes into building small elite teams, whether you're at a startup or if you're building a small tactical, team.
Brad, I'd love to spend some time on Scout Ventures. Late last year announced third fund, 55 million, I believe. Can you give us a quick overview of what you guys are focusing on, the team, et cetera?
Yeah. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that somewhere in between fund 1A and 2, I realized I needed to be a real institutional level firm. Unfortunately, I believe that long before the institutions believe that. So the money didn't show up right away. But, I actually at Scout, we have an SOP, and people they laugh about it. There's an SOP. It tells you how to do everything. It's 100 pages or whatever it is. But first, let's get back to the main thing. So at Scout, we focus on is investing in what we call hard to access founders, which are founders that are veterans of the military, the intelligence community, and national labs that are focused on cultivating and developing frontier technologies, which broadly defined is artificial intelligence, machine learning, autonomy, robotics, drones, physical security, cybersecurity, quantum, and space. And, in there, we're also looking at energy and material science and some other stuff. But in general, that's what we're focused on. And what we did a couple of years ago was we added the mission statement of making the world a better, safer place. So we don't do munitions. We're not working on the next ray gun or ballistic missile. We don't do any of that. We are working on artificial intelligence around waveform communication that is used to have backpack radios that have encrypted communications and can prevent being intercepted. And if they are trying to get intercepted, they can jam back. But that same technology can also be used for 5G and 6G commercial wireless. And, it's used in electronic warfare on the F-22 and the F-35 and nuclear subs. And that company actually came out of the NSA. So that technology was developed by a PhD that had spent 10 years at the NSA, whose mission is really to listen and collect. But, those are the types of things that we get access to. I have an amazing team. I'll start with the other West Pointers since this is a West Point podcast, but I have an amazing grad named Sam Ellis, who I see Tim nodding. Sam's an absolute rock star. And Sam's class of 2012, and he's a partner, runs our New York office. I have a 2003 Naval Academy grad named Wes Blackwell, who runs our DC presence. And then I have a 2016 Naval Academy grad named Stephen DeBartholomew, who's in Austin with me. Stephen and Sam both spent time at the NSA, so I'd say they're fairly smart guys. And then I have an amazing bullpen of venture partners. Ryan McCarthy, the former Secretary of the Army, is a venture partner. Emily McMahon, who is a West Pointer, is a venture partner. Sherman Williams, who's a Naval Academy grad, is a venture partner. And for anybody that doesn't know, Wes and I stood up an organization called the Academy Investor Network. We put up our own money to get the business off the ground. And then we recruited Emily and Sherman to be the managing partners and scale that business. And part of the reason we did that is that over my last 23 years of early stage investing, one of the things that I prided myself on was returning every phone call and responding to every email. And as you scale, that becomes impossible. I think I get 1,000 emails a day. It's insane. But what we wanted to make sure is that we had a platform for grads and veterans to include underrepresented founders, women, people of color. We wanted to have a platform where we could at least connect them in and they could get advice, maybe funding, introductions. And so Academy Investor Network was really our idea that there is no affinity group across the service academies. So why don't we build one? And why don't we create a platform to support entrepreneurship and create funding and mentorship and advisory? And we're hoping at some point that what we're able to do is reach out to grads like Joe DePinto that runs 7-Eleven and Anthony Noto who runs SoFi and Steve Cannon who is at Mercedes and go out to this network of grads and say, hey, can you be the senior advisor related to retail and help build out what that network looks like? I love Joe DePinto. He's an amazing guy. He was very good friends with Anthony DeToto, but he doesn't have time as the head of 7-Eleven to get on the phone with everybody. But he could help as a grad shape what we build as an advisory network to address retail or CPG or whatever. So now maybe it's not Joe that's the guy you talk to, but maybe it's a network of 10 grads across 5 different academies that Joe helped curate that then become a source of information and mentorship. So if Tim has an entrepreneur come with him that has a technology for the retail industry, there's an advisory network within our community of grads that could potentially provide advice. So that's the vision.
I want to riff on that on 3 quick notes. First is the spirit of graduates helping graduates. Brad, you helped me when I was starting off. That phone call, very helpful, candid advice. And that 5-minute aside can change how you think about things drastically. So first, thank you. Second is I'm glad you mentioned the Naval Academy grads that are part of your team. Surprisingly, a number of Naval Academy folks have reached out to us and said they listened to this podcast. The fact that you gave them a shout out is nice. And then the last point is Academy Investor Network and the West Point AOG Entrepreneur Summit. So that's going to happen in Baltimore in October. Can you talk more about that?
I've been fortunate enough that Guy Filippelli looped me in when we created the special interest group around entrepreneurship. And I've been fortunate enough to attend all of the West Point Entrepreneurship Summits. And this year they asked me to chair the West Point Entrepreneurship Summit. So it'll be at the Gaylord Hotel, October 6th through 7th. We are trying a kind of unique format this year where I don't want to give it all away now, Tim, but I would say that it is designed to be much more interactive with the goal of trying to, have a lot more connections happen between grads. And I think it'll be really exciting. Ryan McCarthy will be giving one of the keynotes. We may have General Milley or General McConville, depending on whether or not if we can get their schedules aligned. And we have some other pretty exciting things. We're hoping to have Taylor Justice, the founder of Unite Us, and maybe Socrates Rosenfeld, the founder of Jane Technologies, talk about what it went to go from West Point to building a unicorn. We got some interesting stuff, so I'm pretty excited. So October 6th through 7th, We are still figuring out, depending on capacity, if we will open it up to our brothers and sisters of the other academies. If we have the capacity, we will do that. And it's encouraging to hear that you have grads from Air Force and Naval Academy listening to this podcast, because we know they're not organized to run their own podcast. So they have to listen to ours. No, I'm just kidding. I couldn't not throw one like Army Navy riff in there.
Absolutely. Let's get into our next and third segment, the SOP, or standard operating procedure. In this segment, we're going to talk about the personal routines, habits, and words to live by that have been instrumental to your success. What routines or habits did you form in the military or West Point that you still adhere to?
Fitness, diet, mutual respect is a really big one, which is really added words to live by in there. But I think mutual respect. And then I think as I've gotten older, meditation and being present, which you don't always appreciate when you're at West Point or in the Army. You're like very task driven. Like, I got to get this done and then I can go to Iraq or whatever it is. I always lifted weights and I was always really fit. And then as you get older, you can't box as much and, do whatever. So for me, I do Pilates 3 days a week, every single week, which I think is a game changer. I wish somebody had taught me about Pilates when I was a lot younger. I like to do yoga a couple of times a week. I like to do kettlebells and rings, and I have a big mace that I like to swing around. And I try to take my dog for at least an hour walk 5 days a week. So the fitness thing is big. You are what you eat. Not that living in Texas, I don't overeat tacos and barbecue sometimes. But, if I can focus on trying to be healthy 5 days a week and maybe cheating 2 days a week, I think it gives you more consistent energy and a clearer head. And then in terms of words to live by, the first one I mentioned is that mutual respect. The second one is a cadet will not lie, cheat, or steal, nor tolerate those that do. But there's a lot of bad actors in the business world, and so I think having your guard up and being of the highest moral and ethical fiber is really important. And I think people know that about us in Scout. And I think that's part of our brand. Somebody told me once, Tim, that I should stop focusing on making money and I should start focusing on my purpose and my passion. And it was a really impactful conversation. I actually had a very similar conversation with two different people. One was about finding my purpose, and the other one was about like not focusing on how much money you made, but focus on what you're building and what you're doing and all of that. And that has been totally transformational. Once I stopped worrying about how much money I was making or where I was making money, and I really just focused on what I was building, I started to be much more successful. I started making better decisions. I started selecting better people to be around. And who would have thought that the best way to be successful was to not think about making money?
Brad, quick follow-up to this. And you alluded to how your time with Fund 3 and just kind of what you're doing now is incredibly tight. How do you manage your day-to-day now? Do you carve out time in the morning for emails? Like, how do you manage it now?
So I rely very heavily on an amazing young woman named Holly Love, who is in charge of helping me manage my time. And that's not only externally, but that's also internally. I get on email. I know some people say you should limit, like when you're on email, you shouldn't be on your phone all the time. I actually have a totally different view. I try to get as much done anytime I get a work block. So when I wake up my son and I come to the PC and I bang through the emails, the night before, Holly sends me like what the schedule is, and I kind of have an idea of how chaotic the day is going to be, and we might decide to move something or bump something. But I think really planning, having support, and then also really prioritizing, like knowing that I was doing a podcast was a priority for me, and Holly knew it was a priority. So we made sure that the rest of the day wasn't set up in a way that was going to interfere with what was important to me. I talk to Bobby Weinberger, our lawyer, probably twice a day, sometimes 4 times a day. I think if I don't call Bobby, he thinks there's something wrong with me. So I kind of got to check in. I talk to Sam, Steven, and Wes every day. Normally, I do check-in calls in the morning to make sure I know where everybody is kind of going. And then opportunistically, sometimes you just got to like put the phone on mute and go for a walk. But I'm a firm believer that, you can like bucket in work blocks and manage your time that way. And then the other thing is, and I mentioned this earlier when Tim had asked about it, but I just can't meet with everybody anymore. Like I just don't, there's just not enough time. I think we're at 100 investments. Let's say 60 of those are active. In fund 3, we have 25 active. That's just a lot of work. And we're looking for new deals and we're raising fund 4. Stay tuned. So I would say we're pretty busy. Having a companion like a dog, especially during COVID, is also a pretty good gauge to make sure you're like not being a total crazy person. Like she makes me every day take 20, 30 minutes and clear my head. And so I think when you talk about structure, you got to put in work block times to do work. You have to have meeting times that are in person and certain amount of time on Zoom, but you're not going to be efficient if you spend all day on Zoom. You're just not. And then you got to make time to clear your head. And this morning I got up, I didn't have 20 minutes to meditate. I had 6.5 minutes to meditate. So I meditated for 6.5 minutes. Then I got on the computer. Then I dealt with the dog. Then I dealt with my son. And then the whole day started over.
You've mentioned several really important mentors and friends throughout your career: Anthony DeToto, Ted Williams, Parsons. And we'd love to learn, for the audience, how did you cultivate those relationships?
Yeah, and just to clarify, I wouldn't call Ted a mentor. I would call Ted a classmate that was very good at taking notes and, now does some stuff with us. I would tell you another one out of the long gray line that's been great is Bill Murdy, a legend in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. I was very fortunate to get Bill to invest, but more fortunate to have Bill make introductions and relationships. But I think the way you cultivate those relationships is don't have anything that you need or you ask for. Just go make yourself available and spend time. And great mentors, I think that's what they want. They want to share knowledge. They want to share their thoughts and their experience with those that are going to do something great. You hope that they see some sort of potential in you that you're going to do something great. One of the things that Dick Parsons ingrained in my head is that you can't think about where you're going to be next week, next year. You have to think about, where do I want to be in 5 years? And what do I have to be doing between now and then to get where I want to be in 5 years? And so Dick was one of the first ones that made me like stretch out my horizon of thinking. And by doing that and not always feeling so pressured that you got to get that check tomorrow or you got to close that deal tomorrow, but by adding what I would call at West Point was taught to me as combat patience, or also taught to me by my second platoon sergeant first class Ralph Luna, who was a former Ranger bad guy, who used to say 2 things to me: "Sir, you're not John Wayne. Please buckle your Kevlar." And besides saying that all the time, he would say, "Sir, the key is combat patience. It's allowing the situation to develop, having a plan, not reacting too quickly and not reacting too slowly, but being able to see the situation develop and predict some of the things that are going to happen in that situation." So combat patience from Sergeant Cluna, thinking about where you want to be in 5 years from Dick Parsons, and Anthony DeToto and Bill Murdy teaching me how important it is to honor the long gray line and make yourself available and give advice, even if it's a 5-minute call or a 10-minute coffee, because it is up to us to play it forward and playing it forward. If you believe in karma or whatever the West Point version of karma is, grip hands though it be through the shadows, that requires us to make time. And so for me, I take that really seriously with what we do at Scout. I take that seriously with what Emily and Sherman are building at Academy Investor Network. And I thank the two of you for taking it seriously and creating this content for people to listen to and hopefully impart a little bit of advice that makes everybody's day a little bit better, makes a decision a little bit easier, and in the long run makes everybody do better things.
Two quick notes, observation and question. On the observation, combat patients love it. I think it's one of the first times we've heard it on this podcast. And coming from an enlisted soldier is awesome. And then the other observation is Bill Murdy is episode 2. That's with Eddie Kane, class of 2008, and the founder of the Old Grad Club. Final question for this segment. We have a lot of guests that have talked about the importance of networking and growth in their transition out of the military. It seems like the Academy Investor Network is a great tool and community for helping people as they build their civilian lives and careers. Can you share more about that?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things that exist today that didn't exist back when I transitioned. So I now happen to be a 100% service disabled veteran. But when I got out of active duty, I was, I think, originally rated 30%, which qualified me for vocational rehab, which allowed me to go to grad school and get access to a bunch of government things. So, number one, understand what opportunities the VA puts in front of you when you are transitioning, because there's some pretty good things out there. Number two, there's the Skill Bridge program, which didn't exist until recently. And actually, Stephen De Bartholomew came to us under the Skill Bridge program. So he was still in the Navy. And the last 6 months of active duty, he worked full time at Scout. And that allowed him to get industry experience. But more importantly, it allowed us to basically get a 6-month try before you buy. And he was an absolute fit. So I think there's that. Shift.org and some of these other organizations, we've been working with them with Academy, sometimes Academy grads that are still just transitioning out. Sometimes they're still cadets trying to think about how they need to think through it. I think it's really important to try to do your homework before you reach out to people. Like, at least know the background of that person. Try to find somebody with something common. Oh, he was in First of the 14th Golden Dragons. I was in First of the 14th Golden Dragons. Because when I see that somebody was a Golden Dragon, I'm going to at least respond to that, right? And that's the military camaraderie. Then if somebody says, hey, I grew up in Briarcliff Manor, New York. Well, I grew up in Briarcliff Manor, New York. So I think it's like trying to do enough research and homework around the programs that are available and then the people that are out there. And then I think also have realistic expectations. So Anthony Noto, some of the other people that we mentioned, they're running huge companies. It's not that Noto's not a great guy, but Noto just can't respond to every class of 2019 grad that sends them a note and says, hey, I'm a grad and I care about fintech. So also be realistic about trying to pick like attainable people to talk to, because what might happen is that person might actually be your contact into Noto or Joe DePinto or whatever. And for me, I was super blessed because my first call was to Anthony DeToto, who was the human Rolodex of the Academy Alumni Network. And so anytime I wanted to talk to somebody, DeToto already knew him. So it made it really, really easy. But I would say do your homework, understand what things are out there, reach out to people, make sure you're like cognizant of the fact that everybody is busy, and really have like a quick ask. Because I think that a lot of times, you get your foot in your door, you have a good conversation, and that hopefully, it was really meaningful. Tim came up to me, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, and he goes, "Man, I'll never forget, like, I asked you to help me out, and we had a conversation, and next thing I know, you took me to dinner." And that made me happy that in my regular operandus, I was able to like impact Tim positively. Then Tim carries that forward to the grads that he touches. And so, I think we can all make a difference. It's really important to be a good person and give back, because all of us were really, really fortunate to get the education that we had at the academy, the experience that we had leading soldiers. And in my case, that led to an amazing opportunity at MIT, amazing opportunity with entrepreneurs, and has allowed me to build a firm. And I'm, doing exactly what I should be doing. I'd say the only other thing is we just got to get more institutional investors to agree that we're doing what we should be doing. And then it'll be even more fun.
Yeah, no kidding. That's great, Brad. Last segment that we end on, which I think is a great transition, is what we call giving back. And you've alluded to a lot of things here, but curious, as we have a lot of listeners that are just leaving the military, some of which may want to start their own company, as you thought about as well, what's one other piece of advice that you would give that transitioning veteran looking to start their company?
Okay, I'll answer that, Lance, but I want to touch on one other thing, because when you mention giving back, the first thing that comes to me is giving back to the academy in some form or fashion. And I think a lot of grads don't realize how important it is, especially for AOG, for us to give back in some sort of meaningful fashion. For me, I've been giving since before I could even afford to give. I made my first $25,000 pledge. I had no money. I put it on an American Express card and I donated it to the rugby facility because rugby was so impactful to me. And then, I don't know, a couple of years later, I made some money and I paid off the credit card. But I gave that 25,000 that I didn't have because I gave it for the future generations of cadets that I wanted to have the rugby experience and have the camaraderie and have the leadership. So I think giving back to whatever's meaningful, there's this amazing initiative at the Academy called the Center for Genocide and Holocaust Studies, which is privately funded. If you think about what's going on in the Ukraine right now, it is genocide. If you think about what goes on in Africa and World War II and Native American Indians, it's all about genocide. And I think if we want to create leaders that are really going to change the future of the world, they need to understand that. And so I encourage everybody to support the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at West Point. And then I just got asked to join the board of the Jewish Chapel at West Point, which I think I'll officially get nominated. So the reason I mention all of that is sometimes it's easy to lose sight of the fact that the academy works really hard to give us all these opportunities. But when we get out, we need to make sure that we give back. And so I encourage everybody, listen, if it's $19.94 or it's $19,940, whatever it is, give back because it makes a difference to AOG and it makes a difference to the long gray line. So that's number one. Now, back to the question you really asked, Lance, and I'm sorry. The advice that I give to people that come out of the academy and out of the military is you need to understand how special you are. You're different than everybody else out there. If you were in combat, you had to make decisions, split-second decisions in an everly changing environment where it was life or death. You've got the capacity to think and process information in a way that your peers just don't have. And I'm not knocking on somebody that went to Harvard or Yale or Princeton. Of course, they're smart. But that doesn't mean that after they graduated, they had the experience of really a lot of the foundational skills of being an entrepreneur or being a CEO. Build small teams, cultivate talent, be a good leader, make sure you've got the resources, deal with the ever-changing environment. So I think one of the things to do is to really think about your time in the military and develop your own narrative about why you're special. And I think a lot of times we see these military people and they don't translate their skills to the real world. So when you develop that narrative, part of that is do your C3PO and your universal translator and develop a narrative that works for whatever you want to do next. And if you don't know how to do that, get on Google, read the bios of other people, and get help developing your own personal narrative. Because I would say that's what I did. And the story evolved. The story is much different now than it was in 2001 or 2005. And the other thing that everybody needs to remember is that part of the purpose of life is to evolve and grow. And as you evolve and grow, you've got to integrate those experiences, good and bad, into your narrative and how you conduct yourself moving forward. And so I would tell everybody, develop your narrative, iterate on your narrative, take honest and open feedback, be thick-skinned when people tell you that you're not the right fit. Because if you're not the right fit, who cares? You're the right fit somewhere else. So go find somewhere where you're the right fit or build it yourself. And if you're building it yourself and it's super cool and it involves frontier tech and you're a grad, please come to Sam Ellis and I first.
Amazing, Brad. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. This is an incredible episode. And I think Tim and I would just really like to thank you for all you've done for, one, the Academy, two, grads. And you talked about this a lot. And I think you epitomize this as kind of like growing the network and strengthening the network. So just thanks so much for your time and what you're doing as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm always happy to make myself available. And I guess we'll see you guys October 6th and 7th, West Point Entrepreneurship Summit at the Gaylord Hotel.
On Point is a production of the WPAOG Broadcast Network. Please take a moment to rate and review the show and join us each week for a new episode. Thank you for listening.